Hi everyone, with this video I continue my series of videos on understanding the different sampling methods that can be used by researchers for their research study. In today's video I am going to talk about purposive sampling. Purposive sampling is a non-probability kind of sampling employed by researchers. Now what does that mean? What does non-probability mean? Non-probability means that when you select a sample, not everyone in the sample has an equal chance of getting selected for the research experiment. So what the researcher does through purposive sampling is that he or she uses a series of questions or filtering criteria or certain criteria that they use to select a specific group of people from the sample. Let's talk about some examples, but before I talk about examples, let me also clarify that often researchers interchange the words purposive sampling with convenience sampling. It's not the same. I have made a separate video on convenience sampling. You can watch it in the description section below. Purposive sampling and convenience sampling are not the same, no matter what you read, because convenience sampling is based on the ease with which you can access the research participants. It could be because they are located in a particular geographic area. It could be because an academic wants to easily access the students in their university. So that is when you have easy access of participants, you choose that sampling method, and that is why it's called convenience sampling. Purposive sampling is completely different from convenience sampling. Purposive sampling is when you as a researcher make the informed decision based on pre-selected criteria, predefined criteria as to how you will employ a certain group of individuals or certain individuals from the sample size. So how it is done? It is done by, like I said, there are some methods of doing it. Now there is different types of purposive sampling. Let's talk about the first one. The first one is called typical. What is typical purposive sampling? Typical purposive sampling is when a researcher kind of assumes that a phenomena equally affects the population. There is all the population. So let me take an example here. So the researcher is trying to investigate the relationship between a single parent and an adolescent kid. Now when you say adolescent kid, adolescents can be anything between 13 to 15 or 13 to 16. Now there are many parents who may come in with their adolescent kids, but the researcher decides that I want to investigate only adolescent kids who are more than 15 years of age, between 15 and 16 only. So when the adolescent kids come in and when the parents are coming in, or the researcher decides that I'm only going to investigate adolescent kids who are females, or adolescent kids who are males, or adolescent kids who come from a certain cultural background. So that way, because he or she knows that the relationship or the impact of maybe broken marriage on adolescent kids of the age 15 is going to be experienced very similar. It is going to affect all the adolescent kids, and that is the study they want to do. So when the researcher knows that a certain phenomena affects the research participants in the same way, they use the typical purposive sampling. After typical purposive sampling, we have the extreme or the deviant kind of purposive sampling. This happens when the researcher finds outliers, people who do not fit into the norm of definition of what the researcher was expecting to find. For example, the researcher wants to investigate the effect of war on soldiers, or PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, on soldiers who have engaged in war after 2015, right? So when he starts calling the soldiers with PTSD, he finds that there are soldiers who are not experiencing PTSD. They have been to war, after 2015, but maybe the researcher was assuming that all researchers will show some kind of PTSD, and the researcher finds that there are a couple of soldiers or few soldiers who are not showing any symptoms of PTSD, and they say, oh, these 3 or 4 soldiers are different from the rest of the soldiers, although they have been to the same war, they have been through the same conditions. Let me investigate why this is happening. Why are there outliers or people who are different from what I thought should be like the rest of the population, right? And then we have critical purposive sampling. Critical purposive sampling is when that we try to focus on a small section of the sample to understand how the bigger sample will work as well. So for example, you are trying to investigate people who did not contract COVID, although they were in close proximity or close contact with other COVID patients. And then once you start investigating, you find that maybe they had some virus already in them, and that is why. And then suddenly you find a section of people who probably acquired chickenpox when they were young, because of which and they did not probably acquire COVID, or they did not contract COVID. Now you want to understand why people with chickenpox history in their childhood do not contract COVID even after close contact. So you try to understand this particular section to understand how the bigger population will work as well. So if you understand this smaller group of people, you kind of assume, or you can generalize it to a bigger population as well. All right, then we have the maximum variant kind of purposive sampling. Maximum variant is when you're trying to understand an issue which has impacted everyone in the community or everyone in the population, and you are trying to understand it from different points of view. So for example, the government or the state government has stopped funding for community services groups. Now, when you are trying to understand what happens when funding stops from community services, you are trying to understand it from the point of, let's say, people who provide support in domestic violence cases, people who provide support to alcoholics, community funding for people who provide education services to children of low socioeconomic groups. So you are trying to understand the issue of how stopping of funding affects community services, but you are trying to understand this issue from the multiple perspectives of the different community services, so that you understand the issue in general, but you have a vast understanding of that issue, because although you are only purely studying how funding affects community services, if you understand it from the perspectives of different community services, you will have a broader understanding of it, a much deeper understanding of what happens then. And finally, we have the homogeneous purposive sampling. Homogeneous purposive sampling is when we assume that a certain characteristic, or when a smaller sample shares the same characteristic. So for example, you are trying to study the impact of artificial limbs on people who have lost their dominant limb. Alright, so dominant hand. Alright, so if a person was right-handed and they've lost their dominant right hand and they have an artificial limb, how does that impact their life? But once you start studying, you assume that, or you want to study people who have only lost the dominant use of the right hand only, let's say. So that issue is going to be shared by the people. They have a specific characteristics that is shared by everyone. So that is what is an example of homogeneous characteristic, if I can think of, or issue that in fact it is shared by a small group of people, an issue that is shared by a small group of people, or a cause or an effect that is shared by a small group of people, and you are trying to study that. So although there might be some mixing of drinking water with factory waters nearby, you are only trying to study a population that was impacted by a specific disease, like a skin disease. You are not trying to study everyone who got sick, you are only trying to study a small section of population who are sharing the same characteristics because of a certain phenomena. Alright, so these are the different ways that we can engage in purposive sampling, where we are trying to filter out people and we are trying to study a particular section of people. Now the advantages of this is, of course, that as a researcher you can then show your examiners and reviewers that you have understood the population, the targeted population, and the information that you are getting is very reliable because you are getting it right from the horse's mouth. People who are actually experiencing the phenomena that you are studying. You are not just conducting data collection and getting wasteful data or randomized data. You are actually targeting a population. It's also very cost effective. It is very targeted. You know that you are getting the people that you want to talk to. You are getting valuable data that is from people who are being influenced or being affected by a phenomena. So this way you can justify that your data is valid and reliable. The disadvantage, however, is that often researchers who engage in purposive sampling are criticized for bias. It could be researchers' bias, it could be because you have engaged in some kind of a filtering criteria. Now, how can you go about addressing this bias? So there are ways to do it. So either if you cannot justify why purposive or non sampling was used, or why non-probability sampling was used for your research, then you have to use probability sampling, where all the research participants in the sample have an equal opportunity. So you should be able to justify scientifically why only purposive sampling was required for your research. Otherwise, if you have criteria, you have pre-selected or predefined criteria, you must show how a scientific process or a scientific method was used to filter out the candidates. That you either you can show that you were not involved, and that it was very objective, or it was done by a panel of people. So think of it like this, that when we apply for a job, and when you go for the job interviews, you may see there are 30 candidates sitting and applying for the same job. But once the interview panel goes through those 30 candidates, they might find only 5 or 6 candidates who are very strong, and they want to select 1 or 2 candidates from these 5 candidates. So they are filtering out candidates, and it is very objective, it is unbiased, because it's not one person who's selecting, it is a panel of experts or panel of knowledgeable people who are doing this. So you can show that way as well. So you have to remember that with purposive sampling, the criticism is often of bias, and if you can address it, if you can show how you did it scientifically, how you filtered out participants scientifically, then it's good. Also, sometimes it is hard for you to reach a particular targeted sample size. So many literature says, oh, for purposive sampling you should have at least 100 participants or 50 participants or 30 participants. Now at the end of the day, if you cannot get that, and you cannot force yourself to find, so you should of course try to get as many people as you can through purposive sampling. But if you can justify to the researcher why that finding even a relatively smaller group of sample size was getting you the same information, and everything was done for you by you to acquire the sample size, and you did not compromise on your integrity and ethics, and or you found you used triangulation of data through the same sample size, then of course it is met, or the researcher or the examiner or the reviewer will be happy with that. So I hope you understood what is purposive sampling and why it is used, what are the different types of it, what is the advantage and disadvantage of it. Remember, all sampling methods require you to scientifically, methodologically justify why you used a particular sampling method and how you went about addressing the biases that result from that kind of sampling. So please watch my other videos on sampling methods as well, and I will put out more videos about research and understanding research. Thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing, and I look forward to reading your comments if I have missed anything. Bye for now, guys. See you soon.